Good. Ian, well, thank you very much for taking part this morning. I guess the first question I would ask you about the situation on the Belarus-Poland border is we've seen these new sanctions come into force this morning, or been agreed, I should say, this morning by the EU foreign ministers. Do you think they'll have any impact at all? Do you think they'll have any effect, or will actually this do nothing to deter Lukashenko?
Well, I think these are well-crafted sanctions because they're not directly aimed at Lukashenko, but they're aimed at airlines and travel companies and the like who are involved in facilitating the transport of migrants to Belarus and to the border. And as such, those are companies which probably, in many cases, will have more to lose. And we saw actually last week that a bit of pressure from the EU on Turkish airlines seems quite successfully to have stopped some of the transit through Istanbul that was bringing people to Minsk and allowing the Belarusian authorities to transport them to the border. So, I mean, potentially at least, and obviously we haven't seen all of the details yet, but potentially at least, if these are aiming at people who are not, as it were, transporting migrants for political reasons, but purely for profit reasons, this could be quite an effective way to proceed.
And how would you see Lukashenko or his regime indeed responding to this? I mean, he talked at the weekend about threatening to cut off the gas supplies. There was some reaction there from Vladimir Putin. Do you think he would try ratcheting up the pressure here, or is he getting more and more into a more difficult position if these sanctions come into effect?
Well, I think he probably will try to ratchet up the pressure. The question is, particularly in relation to gas, whether that's a credible threat. The gas pipelines across Belarus are actually owned by Russia's Gazprom, owned and operated by Russia's Gazprom. Lukashenko would actually have to cut across what the Russians have so far said about being reliable suppliers of gas to turn off that supply. I mean, he would have to find some means of forcing Gazprom to do something which so far, at least Gazprom has said it won't do. Now, will he look for other methods? I mean, my understanding is that the situation at the Polish border is, if anything, getting worse, that, shots, possibly blanks, have been fired near the border in order to cause concern or panic, that migrants are being moved to the border again, with Belarusians kind of pushing from behind to get them to try and force their way through the border. So yeah, I think he'll try and keep trying to do that. But I do think it's interesting that some of the, as it were, sort of friendly governments to the EU whose nationals have turned up on this border, like Iraq, are now talking in terms of putting on flights to repatriate some of their nationals. So I think it's not straightforward for Lukashenko to escalate much more.
Now, of course, Belarus doesn't just have a border with one EU member state. It, of course, has borders with Lithuania and Latvia. And you served as British ambassador in Latvia. And we've seen some response from Lithuania and some concerns there. I'm just wondering, the Baltic states more generally, if the focus has all been on Poland, do they fear that perhaps Lukashenko will still try encouraging migrants to come in, but as opposed to heading west, encouraging them to head northwest instead?
Well, so far, the Baltic states seem to have handled this perhaps better than Poland has, in the sense that from an early stage, they involved the EU's border agency, Frontex, and the EU's Asylum Support Office. And so, they set themselves up to be able to process anybody who crossed the border quite quickly. Those who might have a legitimate claim for asylum, they can be processed. Those who very clearly don't have a legitimate claim for asylum can be interned with a view to deportation. Poland has chosen to do this on a national basis, not to get the EU involved, and in some respects even to use this as an instrument in its political battle with Brussels over the rule of law. We saw the former Polish Prime Minister and now member of the European Parliament, Beata Szydło, saying, basically that Europe should see that Poland was defending European values and Europe's borders and stop its absurd attacks on Poland. I think actually, that's offered Lukashenko more opportunities in a way, because it's raised the political stakes for Poland in a way that's perhaps rather unhelpful and contrasts with the way that that Lithuania and Latvia have handled this.
Then perhaps turning slightly further south, obviously we've seen, it's a separate story, but in the case of Ukraine over the weekend, indeed last week, concerns in the White House that the Russians are, they're building up troops on the border. And we can talk maybe in a second as to whether or not these two issues are interlinked, but specifically on Ukraine, would you see, do you think this building up of troops, do you think this is just saber rattling by Putin, or do you think actually that some kind of military advance into Ukraine is on the cards? Because at the moment it seems that Washington is taking this slightly more concerned, at least than the EU capitals are.
Yeah, and I think it's right to be concerned. You can't be certain what Putin is going to do. You can only react to what he has done or is in the process of doing, and what we're seeing is this reinforcement of Russian forces in the area. And I think it's absolutely right for the Americans to respond quite strongly and to put down some firm markers. I think it would not, in my view, be a mistake for those NATO countries that do support Ukraine most strongly to step up their assistance to the country. And I've seen in the British press there's some talk about moving some British troops into Ukraine. I don't think that would be a bad thing. I think this is actually a much bigger issue for European security than a few thousand migrants on the Belarusian border. And what I would say as well is, even if Putin is not intending to do anything on this occasion, we saw this in the spring, we're seeing it now. What you don't want is that you get into a repetitive pattern of Putin building up his forces with no reaction from the other side, and doing it again and again with no reaction from the other side, until he concludes that even if he does cross the border, there will be no reaction. So I think it's very important that each time there is this kind of build-up, the West shows that it is taking it seriously. There is always a tendency to say, well, it's sort of crying wolf. What you have to remember about the story of the boy crying wolf is, at the end of the day, the wolf got the boy. And the reason for that is because, at a certain point, everybody got fed up with responding to it. The lesson is you should respond. And if the wolf is not there, that's great. But it doesn't mean that the wolf will never be there.
And then one final question to finish on this, being some speculation that these two issues, the building up of troops on the Ukrainian border and some suggestion that Putin has been involved encouraging Lukashenko on the migration crisis. Do you see these issues as interlinked, or are they just separate issues which have to happen to be coming to the fore at the same time?
I don't know whether Putin has been assisting or advising Lukashenko to take this sort of action. It's possible, but I have no evidence. But Putin is an opportunist. He will take advantage of any distraction that is offered. We've seen that in the past, where he's often taken advantage of Western governments being distracted by other things in order to advance his interests, whether that was in Ukraine or Georgia or wherever. So it seems to me that whether or not he inspired Lukashenko, he will certainly exploit the opportunity that Lukashenko has given him to increase the pressure on Ukraine at a time when Western attention may be focused somewhere else. And that's another reason why I think it's very important that the Americans have shown that they have got their eye on the Ukrainian border as well.